The Dragonback series by Timothy Zahn. Book 1, Dragon and Thief. Chapter 5.
Jack was still holding the alien data reader. Flipping up his shirt tail, he stuffed the gadget into one of the back pockets of his jeans. How many? He whispered.
Only one set of footsteps,
Dracos murmured back. The dragon head had again lifted out of Jack's shoulder, the long snout poking out under the edge of the shirt.
He moves cautiously, like a warrior.
Or a cop, Jack muttered, crossing as silently as he could to the chair where he'd hung his jacket. He couldn't hear the footsteps himself, but he didn't doubt the dragon's pointy little ears for a minute. Any other way out of here?
There is the bubble,
Dracos said. The snout lifted to point toward the ceiling.
But the ladder is no longer secure.
Jack looked up as he got his arms into his jacket sleeves. It was a good 20 feet up to the first landing, plus another 10 feet to a second landing, and then the broken glass of the bubble. And the ladder did indeed look pretty rickety. But the chance of a two-story fall was still better than tangling with a trained soldier. Or a cop. I'll risk it, he said, shifting direction toward the ladder. He reached it, got a grip on the uprights.
Solidify!
A hard, flat voice snapped from the doorway behind him. Jack froze in place, wincing, caught like a rat in a box, and he still hadn't heard any footsteps. Whoever this guy was, he was way too good for Jack's liking. Don't shoot, he called, putting some near panic into his voice. Please don't shoot.
Turn around,
the voice ordered.
Keep your hands up.
Jack obeyed, turning just far enough to keep his right shoulder toward the newcomer. The tangler belted at his left hip was a short-range weapon, and he wanted to keep it his little secret as long as possible. The figure standing just inside the room to the right of the doorway was big and wide and definitely not human. He was a Brumga, most of his round face obscured by his helmet. He was dressed in a mismatched collection of ground soldier combat gear, with a dark red helmet, blue protector vest, and green combat fatigues. A small orange medkit hung from the left side of his belt beside some kind of wand and a narrow brown and white striped holster. The combined effect of his body shape and the colorful outfit made him look rather comical. There was nothing funny about the shoulder-slung weapon pointed in Jack's direction. It was black and shiny and nasty looking, and would probably make a serious mess if the Brumga pulled the trigger. Whatever thoughts Jack might have had about using this tangler vanished quietly into the morning mists. But he had to do something. If these Valaga guys Dracos had mentioned didn't want any witnesses to their attack, a Brumga was just the sort of bone-headed hatchet man to cheerfully clean the plate for them. Jack's only hope was to convince the Brumga that he knew absolutely nothing about what was going on.
Who are you?
The Brumga demanded.
What are you doing here?
I didn't mean anything, Jack pleaded, using the frightened child whine that Uncle Virgil had found so useful on so many jobs. I saw the ship and just wanted to see if there was anything I could use. I didn't mean anything.
How did you see the ship?
The Brumga asked.
Where did you come from?
Right over there, Jack said, waving vaguely off to the side. We've got a little place off in the forest. The alien made a sound like a bass drum being attacked by a gang of chipmunks.
How many of you are there?
He demanded, starting across the room toward Jack.
What did you see?
What do you mean? Jack asked, trying to sound bewildered. It wasn't easy to out-stupid a Brumga, but he was determined to give it his best shot. We saw this ship. I told you that.
Before you saw the ship,
the Brumga growled. It was close enough now for Jack to see that his fatigues carried no military rank badges or insignia.
What happened?
I don't know. What do you mean, what happened before? Well, there was a lot of noise, Jack huffed, as if that should be obvious, still keeping his right shoulder toward the Brumga as the other approached. The Tangler was no longer an option, not with that gun pointed at his chest. But his shirt and jacket were still open in front, and the last thing he wanted was to let the other get a clear view of Dracos wrapped around his chest. What do you mean, what happened?
Did you see anything up in space?
The Brumga asked.
Were you watching up into space?
Jack blinked. Into space? He asked. Along the left side of his rib cage, the side away from the Brumga, he could again feel the flowing paint sensation as Draco stealthily changed position. If the dragon was getting restless with the conversation, he wasn't the only one.
You ask many questions,
the Brumga rumbled, his ugly face turning even uglier.
But you don't answer any. Maybe you need help with your mouth.
Look, I didn't mean anything, Jack said, putting a little more whine into his voice as he tried desperately to come up with a good story. The Brumga was only 4 steps away. Another few seconds, and Jack was probably going to find that big ugly gun pressed up against his cheek. If he didn't come up with something before then, without a warning, a horrible scream pierced the air. It was a sound like Jack had never heard before, and in that single terrifying second, he hoped he would never hear it again. It was like the cry of a screech owl twisted together with the howl of a hunting wolf, with the wail of a banshee from Uncle Virgil's old Irish legends thrown into the mix. It seemed to come from everywhere and from nowhere, bouncing around the room and threatening to bring down the rest of the glass from the broken bubble above them. The Brumga reacted instantly, dropping into a crouch and swinging his gun around to point at the doorway behind him. And as he turned away from Jack, there was a sudden surge of movement and weight at Jack's back, and a twitching at his holster. The weight disappeared as something fell from beneath his shirt. Jack twisted his head around, just in time to see Dracos land silently on the deck behind him, with Jack's tangler clutched in his front paws. There was a soft choof, and an instant later, the tangler cartridge burst against the Brumga's upper back, sending hundreds of thick, milky white threads bursting outward. The threads whipped around him, wrapping themselves around his torso, head, and arms like an instant spider web. He howled, staggering off balance as he tried to turn around, but he was way too late. Even as he spun back, his gun pointing mostly upward where the tangle of threads had trapped it, the cocoon completed itself. With a brief flash, the capacitor built into the cartridge discharged, sending a jolt of stunning electrical current through its captive. The Brumga gave a pitiful dog-like yelp, toppled onto the deck, and lay still. Dracos was already in motion, bounding over to the fallen mercenary and giving him a quick examination.
An interesting weapon,
he commented, turning back to Jack.
We had best get moving.
It took Jack 2 tries to find his voice.
Right,
he managed. Was that you?
A Kada battle cry,
Draco said, flipping the tangler to Jack.
It seemed a reasonable diversion. Are you ready?
I'm 3 blocks past ready, Jack said, dropping the weapon back into its holster.
Pardon?
Skip it, Jack said. The ladder?
Yes,
Draco confirmed, turning his glittering green eyes upward toward the bubble.
When I say...
Crouching down, he leaped. Jack followed him with his eyes, feeling his mouth drop open. 20 feet straight up, and the dragon made it with a foot or 2 to spare. Twisting around, cat-like, on the narrow landing, he got his front paws firmly wrapped around the upper part of the ladder.
Now, come,
he said. Hang on, Jack said, kneeling down beside the unconscious Brumga as a sudden thought struck him.
What are you doing?
Dracos demanded. Trying to get this thing out, Jack told him, digging into the tangler webbing over the long, holstered wand lying along the mercenary's left leg.
An unknown weapon is dangerous to use,
Dracos warned. You mean like my tangler? Jack retorted. You seem to handle that just fine.
I am a Kada warrior,
Draco said stiffly.
The understanding and use of weapons is my profession.
You're still lucky I hadn't put the safety catch back on, Jack grunted. Don't worry, a slapstick's the easiest thing in the world to use. You press the button at your end and touch the other guy with the other end, and he won't be bothering you for a couple of hours. Rats.
What?
It's buried too deep under the webbing, Jack said, standing up again. Never mind, here I come. Even with the dragon bracing the top, the ladder felt pretty shaky. He didn't want to think what it would have been like without the extra support. But the ladder held, and so did the one at the upper control area. The lower section of the dome wasn't as badly crunched as it had looked from below, but there were several gaps big enough for them to get through. A minute later, they were standing outside on the top of the ship.
"Where is your spacecraft?"
Dracos asked. "Way back there," Jack said, pointing toward the forested area to the right. "There's a crack in the hull about 50 yards back where I came in."
"Good,"
Dracos said.
"Quickly then."
They headed off. The damage wasn't as bad up here as it had been along the sides of the hull, Jack noted, but the handful of trees lining both sides more than made up for it. Most of them had been smashed into toothpicks as the ship plowed through the area, and those that remained standing had been knocked about at crazy angles. Mostly they were leaning away from the ship, but a few were actually leaning toward it. Everything within sight, trees and ground alike, had been scorched and blackened by the heat of the crash. They were probably lucky the crash hadn't sparked a forest fire. From the direction of the wrecked bubble behind them came the faint sound of crunching metal. Jack spun around, tangler in hand, but no one was visible. "You think the ladder went down?" he hazarded.
"With some assistance, yes,"
Draco agreed.
"I believe the pursuit has begun. Come, over here."
He veered suddenly toward the edge, aiming toward a tree that was leaning inward.
"Wait a second,"
Jack said, frowning as he turned to follow.
"The SNA's still farther back. If we remain here, they will have a very limited search area,"
Dracos explained over his shoulder.
"On the ground, our chances of eluding them are greater."
"Yeah, but it's 40 feet to the ground," Jack objected. "There was a ladder built on the hull near where I came in. Let's use that."
"All ladders will be watched,"
Dracos said.
"This they may not expect."
"Right," Jack muttered, throwing a dubious look at the tree they were making for. Leaning toward the ship, yes, but at its closest, it was still a good 10 feet away. "I suppose it's too late to mention that my species doesn't jump nearly as well as yours does."
"Do not worry,"
Dracos said, trotting to a halt beside the tree at the point where the hull started its downward curve. This time, he didn't even bother to crouch, but just jumped from a standing start over to the tree. For a second, he hung there, all 4 feet clinging to the tree, with claws Jack hadn't noticed before. Then, turning his head, he peered back toward Jack.
"Leap when I say,"
he said.
"Ready?"
With a convulsive jerk, the dragon pushed away with his hind legs and arched his whole body backwards, like a reversed vid of how he landed on the tree in the first place. The arching continued until he was stretched straight back toward Jack. His tail uncurled and stiffened.
"Leap,"
Dracos ordered. If Jack had stopped to think, he never would have done it. To jump to the tail of an unknown alien as it hung from a fire-damaged tree was an amazingly stupid thing to do. But all he could think about at the moment was the tangled Brumga and his buddies. He jumped as ordered, caught the golden-scaled tail, and a second later slammed against the blackened tree trunk as the dragon collapsed back to vertical again.
"Can you climb down from here?"
Dracos asked.
"Sure,"
Jack said, breathing hard as he shifted his grip from the dragon's slippery tail to the tree itself. He hadn't managed to get his feet up in front of him in time, and the impact had knocked a fair amount of the wind out of him. Fortunately, his jacket had protected him for the worst of the scrapes he might otherwise have collected. Taking a couple of deep breaths to steady himself, he started down. Most of the branches had been splintered or knocked off by the ship's crash, but there were enough limb stumps still sticking out to provide hand and footholds. Dracos, having swiveled around on the tree until he was face down like a squirrel, passed him going down the opposite side of the trunk. 2 minutes later, they were on the ground.
"Where now?"
Dracos asked. Jack looked around, orienting himself as he brushed the worst of the soot off his hands. "This way," he told the dragon, angling off through the scorch zone. "There's a small clearing we were able to put down in just past that ridge over there. Uncle Verge?"
"The ship's ready."
Uncle Verge's voice came from his comm clip.
"Better hurry. If the amount of ground radio traffic is anything to go by, they're starting to heat up the search for you."
Jack nodded grimly. "Terrific." "Right," he said. "Here we come."